In the bitter winter of 1558, a suffocating unease swept through the stone halls of St. James's Palace. Servants whispered in dread, ministers avoided her bedchamber, and even the most seasoned courtiers found excuses not to approach. Something was terribly wrong with their queen. Queen Mary I, daughter of the infamous Henry VIII and the first woman to rule England in her own right, was no longer the proud figure who had once stood defiant against an empire of Protestants. At 42, her body had betrayed her with such grotesque intensity that it horrified even those who had once cheered her rise to power. Her skin had turned the color of old parchment, yellowed, sickly, almost translucent under the dim candlelight. Her stomach had swollen to monstrous proportions, stretching the fabric of her royal gown. Her limbs puffed and stiffened as if death itself were inflating her from within. But it was the smell that made the palace tremble. It crept under the heavy oak doors, slithered through the corridors, and clung to the tapestries like rot clings to damp wood. It was the stench of decay, not of someone dying, but of someone already dead. And yet Mary still breathed. Royal physicians, educated in Latin but blind to modern science, could do little but observe in horror. They believed her condition was likely a cancer of the womb or liver, diseases they had no words for, no cures for, no hope against. Their only tools were superstition, leeches, and prayer. And none of it helped. The queen, still clinging to her title and divine right, lay in a grand four-poster bed, wrapped in silks that now reeked of sickness. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, had softened into a frail murmur. She drifted in and out of fevered sleep, sometimes crying out in Latin, other times whispering fragments of prayer. Her attendants, those who hadn't fled, were rotated constantly, unable to withstand the sight or smell of what she had become. What made it worse, what truly chilled the court, was the irony. Here was Mary, the queen who had burned nearly 300 Protestants alive in the name of faith, now burning from within by a fire she could not control. Her internal organs swelled and liquefied. Lesions broke across her skin like black flowers blooming on a corpse. No physician could stop it, no priest could save her, and no prayer, no matter how devout, could reach whatever God had sentenced her to this living damnation. This wasn't simply the slow death of a Tudor monarch. This was the unraveling of a woman in full view of her kingdom, a queen dissolving inch by inch into death while the world watched from behind silk curtains and turned their faces away. The rot had begun. Mary wasn't simply dying. She was being consumed. From the inside out, her body burned with an invisible flame no water could quench and no prayer could smother. It was a bitter irony not lost on her court or her people. The queen who had ordered hundreds of souls to be set alight for heresy was now herself the victim of a fire far crueler, far slower. Her organs swelled, cracked, and blistered like the flesh of those she had once condemned. And unlike them, there was no quick end waiting. Only the endless, smoldering agony of a body turning against itself. To those who had witnessed the burnings at Smithfield and Oxford, who had seen Protestants tied to stakes, wrapped in chains, pleading for mercy, Mary's suffering was poetic. Poetic but terrifying, because this was no execution. It was divine judgment unfolding in real time, in the Queen's own bedchamber. Her torment was not carried out by heretics or foreign enemies. Came from within. Her God, it seemed, had turned against her. Even her most loyal priests began to whisper behind closed doors. How could a woman so devout, so obedient to the Holy Church, be subjected to such torment? Some said it was a test of her soul. Others feared it was a warning to the faithful. Not all zeal is righteous, not all violence sanctioned in heaven. Mary, once the self-proclaimed savior of Catholic England, now lay powerless. Her crown, resting on a nearby table, may as well have been made of wax. It offered no protection, no authority over the disease eating her alive. Her royal seal still stamped documents, but her signature came now in trembling strokes, barely legible. Pain defined her every breath. Her attendants swore she felt flames in her gut, like coals glowing behind her ribs. She moaned about the burning, day and night, clutching her abdomen with fingers that had turned purple with bruising and decay. Her lips, blackened and dry, murmured Latin prayers with increasing desperation. Still, nothing changed. There was no miracle, no easing. As the weeks dragged on, Mary's suffering ceased to be a secret. Ambassadors wrote home about it. Nobles refused her summons. Even Philip II, her husband and King of Spain, remained conspicuously absent, avoiding the death chamber that had become her court. In the end, all that Mary had built, the altars restored, the heretics silenced, the power seized, meant nothing. Her faith had not saved her. Her bloodline did not shield her. Her reign had promised rebirth for the old religion, but now her body mirrored its fate, bloated, broken, and rotting away under the weight of its own cruelty. What remained of the queen was no longer majestic, nor merciful. She was a symbol now, a warning carved in flesh and flame. A monarch reduced to ashes before death had even claimed her. Mary was born into splendor. In 1516, she entered the world as the long-awaited daughter of King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon. For years, she was the pearl of the English court, cherished, celebrated, and treated as the heir to a powerful dynasty. Foreign ambassadors praised her intellect, her poise, and her charm. She received the finest education of any royal woman in Europe, learning Latin, French, music, and statecraft with ease. The path ahead of her was clear. She would rule one day, not as a consort, but as queen. But all of that was shattered when Henry VIII grew impatient for a male heir. When the king fell in love with Anne Boleyn, everything Mary knew was ripped from her hands. Her father's marriage to her mother was declared invalid, and with a stroke of a pen, Mary was no longer legitimate. She was stripped of her royal title, her household dismissed, her status reduced to that of a servant. The fall was swift and brutal. Mary, once treated like royalty, was forced to serve in the household of her infant half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. It was a humiliation crafted with intention. Henry wanted to break her will, to force her to accept his new marriage and the Protestant faith he had used to justify it. But Mary refused. She clung to her mother's honor and the Catholic faith that had sustained her since childhood. The punishment for that defiance was relentless. She was barred from seeing her mother, even as Catherine lay dying in exile. Every letter was screened, every word monitored. Her movements were restricted, her friends dismissed, her servants replaced by spies. Day after day, she lived under threat, told that if she did not yield, she could face imprisonment, or worse. Over time, the bright, confident child faded. Mary became withdrawn, suspicious, and deeply wounded. Her body began to mirror the strain. She suffered chronic headaches, irregular bleeding, and symptoms that modern doctors might now call depression or anxiety. But to her court, it was simply more proof that she was difficult, unstable, and dangerous. Alone, isolated, and constantly watched, Mary turned inward. The Catholic Church became her refuge. Her faith was the only thing she had left that hadn't betrayed her. In prayer, she found purpose. In the rituals of the old religion, she found something sacred, something unshakable. But it also planted a dangerous seed. From this crucible of fear and humiliation was born a woman who would never forget. She learned early that mercy was a luxury, and that power, once lost, must be taken back by force. Her father had taught her that even the closest bonds could be broken in the name of ambition. One day, Mary vowed, she would reclaim what had been stolen, and when she did, she would never show weakness again. When Mary Tudor finally seized the throne in 1553, she was already 37 years old. In Tudor England, that was considered far too old to bear a child. And yet, not long after she was crowned Queen of England, she believed truly and deeply that she was pregnant. At first, there were subtle signs: a missed period, morning sickness, a swelling in her abdomen. To Mary, this was no illusion. It was divine justice, proof that God had rewarded her faith and would give her a Catholic heir to save England's soul. As her body continued to change, she claimed to feel the child move within her. Courtiers, clergy, and physicians all confirmed the pregnancy, none daring to challenge the Queen's word. The court buzzed with excitement. A royal nursery was prepared. Midwives and wet nurses were hired. Foreign powers began negotiations, assuming the arrival of an heir would cement Mary's place on the world stage. Bells rang. Prayers were said. Celebrations began early. But the months passed, and nothing came. No labor, no child, no heartbeat. Physicians quietly began to suspect the truth, but said nothing. Mary waited in painful anticipation, day after day, month after month, convinced she was still with child. When at last the charade collapsed, she fell into despair. The pregnancy had been false. Her swollen belly, perhaps the result of tumors or psychological trauma, had betrayed her. The shame was unbearable. Her enemies whispered that it was punishment for her sins, the blood of Protestants staining her womb. Her allies remained silent, too fearful or too polite to say what everyone now knew. The Queen had been deluded. Worse still, her husband, Philip II of Spain, had no patience for humiliation. He left England soon after the false pregnancy, and his letters became fewer, colder, more distant. He had married Mary for political gain, not love, and with no heir, the marriage had become useless. Then, in 1557, it happened again. Mary announced a second pregnancy. The signs returned. The belly swelled once more. But this time, the court was more cautious. Fewer preparations were made. Rumors circulated that the Queen had lost her mind. Some believed she was faking it to hold on to power. Others thought she was possessed, her mind unraveling from years of trauma, isolation, and guilt. The second phantom pregnancy ended just like the first. No child, no heir, only silence. Mary withdrew deeper into herself. She began suspecting everyone. Her ladies-in-waiting, her advisors, even her priests. She believed they were mocking her behind closed doors, that they plotted to dethrone her, that God was testing her in cruel, invisible ways. The woman who once held the hopes of Catholic England now found herself clutching a dream that never existed, while her body and mind began to wither in the long, echoing halls of an empty palace. By the mid-1550s, Queen Mary I was no longer just a ruler. She was an instrument of divine fire, at least in her own mind. The England she inherited was fractured, its soul divided between the Catholic faith she cherished and the rising tide of Protestant reformers who threatened to wash away the old world. To Mary, their resistance was not simply heresy, it was treason against God himself, and she would not tolerate it. Thus began one of the most infamous chapters in English history. The burnings did not start as random cruelty. They were, in Mary's eyes, acts of salvation. She believed that by forcing heretics to recant or face the flames, she was offering them a final chance at eternal life. Their earthly suffering, she reasoned, was a small price to pay for the redemption of their souls. Death by fire was not punishment, it was purification. But Mary didn't simply sign decrees and leave the details to her ministers. She personally reviewed reports. She read letters. She approved individual executions. In some cases, she demanded more public burnings, furious that the fear wasn't spreading fast enough. She exchanged correspondence with bishops, urging them to show spiritual firmness and not relent in the face of emotional pleas. What horrified England, and eventually even her allies, was not just the brutality of the executions, but Mary's intimate involvement in them. She wanted the victims to hear sermons before their deaths, to be reminded of what they rejected. She insisted that the flames be visible to crowds, that the pain be instructive, that the spectacle serve both heaven and her throne. But her plans backfired. Rather than silence Protestant voices, the fires ignited them. People watched their neighbors burn and felt only revulsion, not repentance. The condemned sang hymns as their flesh blackened and curled. Some forgave their executioners. Others prayed out loud for Mary herself. Martyrs were made in smoke and ash. And with every pyre, her subjects' sympathy shifted further from the Queen to the flames. Even the Pope, her spiritual commander, grew uneasy. He sent word urging mercy. He saw that the optics of this reign of fire were damaging the church's reputation. But Mary would not bend. She believed herself chosen, her suffering proof of divine alignment. Doubt to her was weakness, compromise, heresy, and so the fires continued. Smithfield, Oxford, Canterbury, London, town after town, blaze after blaze. By the time it ended, nearly 300 men, women, and even teenagers had been burned alive. England, once merely divided, was now traumatized. Mary remained unshaken publicly, but in her private chambers, she grew increasingly unstable. Why wasn't the fear working? Why were the people drifting further from Rome? She could not see that she was creating saints, not suppressing sin. The Queen had intended to save her country's soul. Instead, she had scorched it. By the autumn of 1558, Queen Mary I no longer resembled a living monarch. Her skin had turned a sickly yellow, like parchment soaked in bile. Her once proud frame had swollen grotesquely in places, most notably her abdomen, while the rest of her body withered to bone. She could no longer hold down food. Vomit stained her pillows. Blood tainted her linens. Her bowels were in rebellion, and every attempt to relieve herself left her more dehydrated, more desperate, and more ashamed. But the worst part wasn't what could be seen, it was what could be smelled. The stench from her chambers was unimaginable, like rotting meat left to decay in summer heat. A sickly sweet, acrid odor that soaked into the tapestries, seeped under doors, and clung to the clothes of those forced to attend her. Ministers and physicians began refusing audiences. Servants rotated hourly. Some fainted. Others vomited just outside her chamber. Only the most devout, and the most desperate, dared remain by her side. She was, in essence, decaying while still alive. Still, Mary insisted on ruling. From her sweat-drenched bed, she continued to read reports, issue orders, and sign documents with a trembling hand. Her voice had become a hoarse whisper. Her lips were cracked, blackened at the edges, and often bled when she tried to speak. When she did manage to mutter commands, those near her had to lean in uncomfortably close, fighting the urge to recoil from the fetid breath that carried her last decrees. Her face had become something out of a nightmare. Sunken cheeks, skin stretched tight across her cheekbones like dried leather, eyes yellowed and sunken deep into their sockets. Her hair, once auburn and curled with care, now lay in damp, tangled strands stuck to her temples. Some courtiers swore they had seen her skull through the thinned flesh of her forehead. Others began calling her, quietly, behind closed doors, the living corpse, and then came the convulsions. Without warning, her frail body would jerk violently, ribs rising sharply from under thin skin, fingers twitching as if her nerves were firing their final, desperate signals. Sometimes her whole frame would shudder, sending priests and ladies in waiting into fits of panic. She screamed during the worst of them, ragged, animal-like cries that echoed through the stone corridors of the palace. More than one ambassador described hearing those screams from rooms several chambers away. By now, the royal court had effectively collapsed. Foreign dignitaries refused to be received. Her council avoided official meetings. Only a few brave souls still pretended governance continued. The Queen of England, who once commanded armies, silenced dissenters, and forced heresy to the stake, now commanded only her own decay. Her authority extended no further than the edge of her bed, and yet, she clung to her crown, even as her body betrayed her, even as death crept through her flesh, cell by cell. She would die as queen, even if she died alone in a room. No. As Queen Mary I drifted toward death, reality itself began to blur. The woman who had once ruled with iron certainty was now caught between visions, some divine, some infernal. At times, she claimed to see the Virgin Mary standing at the foot of her bed, arms outstretched, promising salvation and eternal peace. In other moments, her voice, once regal and commanding, shrank into breathless whispers of terror. She would clutch her bedsheets and scream about demons dragging her to hell, clawing at her soul for her failure to save Catholic England. These episodes terrified even her most loyal priests. Trained in doctrine and discipline, they had comforted the dying for years, but nothing in their experience prepared them for what they witnessed in Mary's final days. They prayed over her, recited Latin rites, sprinkled holy water, and tried to assure themselves that what they saw was not possession, but the agony of a devout soul tested beyond endurance. Still, behind their rosaries, they whispered, "Has her mind shattered? Or her spirit?" Outside the Queen's chamber, death was being prepared. The palace began its quiet descent into mourning. Black drapes were ordered, the royal tomb made ready, the funeral ceremony outlined in Latin on parchment. Yet even these traditions, centuries old and sacred, had to be reconsidered. Because Mary's death was not silent. It was putrid. By the final week, her body had become so corrupted that even the most basic rituals of royal passing were disrupted. Her skin oozed dark fluids, and the stench, already unbearable, now seeped through stone walls and wooden doors. When her breath finally ceased, the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was grim relief. No one dared linger in the room. Her closest ladies-in-waiting crossed themselves and fled. Normally, the embalming of a royal body was a solemn process, done with reverence and skill. But Mary's corpse, so long decaying from the inside, had become something beyond control. When physicians attempted to remove and preserve her heart for burial in a separate reliquary, they discovered it had nearly liquefied. The organ, once thought to carry the devotion of a Catholic queen, was now a blackened mass of rot and ruin. Some claimed it was poetic. Others called it divine judgment. The funeral was rushed. What was meant to be a grand affair filled with incense, choirs, and golden processions was cut short. The odor was too strong. Even the abbey, soaked in centuries of sacred ritual, could not contain the smell of her rotting legacy. In the end, Mary died as she had lived, haunted by faith, plagued by fear, and torn between glory and grief. No angelic chorus came. No light shone through the windows. Just shadows, silence, and the lingering scent of a body that had burned from within long before death arrived. Queen Mary I had dreamed of immortality, not through statues or songs, but through spiritual salvation. She wanted history to remember her as the woman who restored the true church to England, who reversed her father's heresies and saved millions of souls. She imagined herself a redeemer, a second Catherine of Aragon, a Catholic Joan of Arc with a crown. But when she died, that dream crumbled faster than the flames she had once used to burn heretics. Across Protestant Europe, her death was met not with sorrow, but with celebration. In Geneva, Frankfurt, and parts of the Netherlands, bells rang, not for mourning, but for thanksgiving. Pamphlets were printed. Sermons were preached. The woman who had reigned in fire was gone. In London, the mood shifted overnight. Streets once haunted by fear grew louder with chatter. People whispered more freely. The bonfires that lit up on dark winter nights were no longer for martyrs, but for hope. And Philip II of Spain, her absent husband and political partner, didn't even pause to mourn. He began immediate negotiations with Elizabeth, Mary's Protestant half-sister, preparing to realign Spain's influence with the new queen. Mary's vision of a Catholic rebirth died with her, and was buried faster than her decaying body. The Protestant martyrs she had tried to erase instead became legends. Their stories, retold in sermons, passed between exiles, and eventually compiled in works like Fox's Book of Martyrs, etched themselves into English identity. People remembered the flames, the hymns sung from the stakes, the prayers shouted over the roar of fire. The image of Protestants burning while the Queen watched coldly from a distance became part of the nation's cultural DNA. It was not long before she earned the name that history would never forget: Bloody Mary. To those who came after, she became a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything England feared: foreign influence, religious tyranny, absolute monarchy. Her marriage to a Spanish king had made her suspect. Her burnings made her infamous. Her childless death made her irrelevant, and her inability to bend, to listen, to love without control, made her tragic. She had ruled for just 5 years. But in those 5 years, she had turned hope into terror and promise into pain. Even in death, she couldn't escape judgment. While some whispered prayers for her soul, others said her suffering had been deserved. Divine punishment, they claimed, for the hundreds who had screamed under the fire she ordered. Mary Tudor wanted sainthood. History gave her a curse, and so her name lived on, not in stained glass or sacred texts, but on the tongues of children dared to summon her in candlelit mirrors. She had tried to save England's soul. Instead, she became the ghost that haunted it.